1967 Vostok Amphibia 420-59, the vintage's new dive watch of the 1960s.
Swarovski Rossi Vremi Vrabetebia.
Okay, I'd like to do a semi-proper review of this piece without resorting to a cringy wing-a-dinger voice like last year. I didn't actually grow up in the 1960s, but I imagine it was mostly about hippie culture, Vietnam, birth control pills, and bell-bottoms. Basically anything they glorified on Mad Men. And somewhere between the Woodstock Music Festival and mutually assured nuclear winter, the dive watch became the quintessential daily piece a man could wear with a suit. Again, thanks to Sean Connery and Goldfinger when he wore the sub in a tux. Damn, what a time to be alive, 1967. But the decade was much more than the Rolex sub or the Blank Pan 50 Fathoms that people remember, because those pieces were technically 1950s. The 60s was when the fun really began. We had pieces like the Zodiac Seawolf, one of the first pieces to ever offer a rotating clicking bezel, used by the Navy in Vietnam. There was a ZRC Grand France 300 with a 6 o'clock protected crown, monoblock case, and an easy cleaning system that allowed the bezel to be rinsed with water. We also got the Seiko 62 Mas that carried the brand's DNA for all its dive pieces going forward, with respect to dial and case design. We even had the legendary Doxa Sub 300, developed by legendary diver Jacques Cousteau. All of these pieces roughly had that skin diver look that was incredibly functional, with large plots and hands, and domed acrylic crystal. In fact, most modern dive watches today, with the exception of material differences and build quality, aren't actually that different from the watches of this era. In fact, lots of micro brands like Laurier and Baltic outright cater to this demographic. But what if you could actually get an old new stock of 60s diver watches at a somewhat reasonable price? For a long time, that answer was found in a small factory in Chistopol, Russia. The Vostok Amphibia belongs in the hallowed halls of legendary 1960s divers, despite its relatively tame status. For those that don't know, the watch was commissioned by the Russian military to a Mikhail Novikov and a Vera Belov at Vostok to create a new design without the use of foreign patents, to be used by military frogmen for underwater rescue missions. Perhaps because they didn't want to pay royalties, or the machinery couldn't handle machining too thick a steel piece. In any case, this was the first time a dive watch had to be built from the ground up, and while it may not look it, the Amphibia holds a few innovations that we don't even see in today's budget pieces. To start, the watch has a beautiful double-domed lucite acrylic crystal that deforms elastically under water pressure, flattening and rubbing against the bezel. This creates a tighter seal to keep the water out and prevents the bezel from rotating accidentally. When you're just hanging out at the Holiday Inn pool at atmospheric pressure, however, the crystal goes back to its domed, snug fit. Meanwhile, most dive watches use rigid crystals that use an O-ring or a gasket that just sits there, stressed, like a Workaholics Anonymous meeting. We also have the steel caseback that is split in two, one flat piece that sits atop a gasket, and a ring that screws on top. This prevents any shear force in the gasket, and the caseback simply pushes into it at higher depths. Even cheap casters today use a single steel caseback that shears on an O-ring when you screw it in, so you have to replace that little O-ring every time you change the battery. This system fixed it in 1967, yet nobody has really copied this idea. The last quirk of the Amphibia is the clutch mechanism with the crown, so the crown is separated from the stem to prevent shock damage from entering the movement, and to engage it, you need to pull on it slightly while rotating. This means the crown wobbles around when unscrewed, but this offers superior protection to even advents like crown guards or a built-in shock mechanism inside the movement. It's not refined, but it's a low-cost solution and it's incredibly functional. You won't find this in a Rolex sub, that's for sure. So with all of this, the watch reaches its incredible potential set up by its designers: high water resistance, no foreign patents, and the ease of mass production. And that was fine in 1967 Soviet Russia. But 60 years later, none of its unique design ideas have trickled down into the watch space. Even cheap watches all have stainless steel casebacks, and hardened sapphire glass has become the norm for watches under the $200 mark, meaning the adaptive design of the Amphibia is not commercially relevant anymore. But should that mean its innovative ideas should die with the watch? Now look, I'm not suggesting that the watch, while niche, is going to die off slowly, even with all the global conflict that's been happening in the past few years. There's tons of interest in the budget watch space for this piece, tons of aftermarket items, and colorways of the watch. I think it's pretty obvious that my favorite is a scuba guy with this aftermarket Seiko SKX bezel. There's even a newer lineup of the Amphibia line that have sprung up for those who want something more 21st century, though these pieces are not necessarily related to the Vostok company based in Chesterpool. The Amphibia, and to a lesser extent the Komodirski, their brass-filled field officer's watch, is what Vostok, at least in the West, is still known for. And it's rare for a product or company to be still known, just as it was back in the 1960s. All of the brands I mentioned before have modern reissues of their 1960s watches, but almost none of them carry the same size and material choices back then, due to market regulations or a different consumer sentiment. Okay, yes, there is Casio, who haven't changed the design of their popular pieces since the 1980s, but they do make upgrades to their old models with a new name. The Amphibia is more or less the same as it was back in the day, for better or for worse. While it has an iconic design, the other dial colors and case shapes are all over the place in terms of dial design and sizing, but somehow they all look the part. It's almost impossible to mistake it with another watch of this era. What does date the watch, however, is its movement, so let's talk about that briefly. The movement on this thing, a Vostok 2416B caliber, has a seemingly geriatric 19,800 beat rate per hour, and a rough 40-hour power reserve. And I know what you're thinking. A basic Seiko 5 has a higher beat rate. But this was done to keep the service life of the movement for over 10 years. And provided that you can get it adjusted and wear it a lot, the watch can actually keep time within plus or minus 10 seconds a day in accuracy. That's another quirk with this piece, is that you have to put in the effort to wear it and physically move around to keep the accuracy up. Otherwise, the static beat error makes it lose 30 seconds a day. It actually reminds me a lot of the Honda S2000, where you have to drive the car at 9 or 10 tenths to get the most out of it. It demands perfection from you and rewards you in spades when you do. One downside about this watch, remaining popular in the West, is that it loses a bit of its mythos. Like if the watch was only available in Russia, you would hear stories about how you'd have to earn this after enlisting in the Spetsnaz, or as a prize for downing 3 bottles of vodka at a military base. It still has a legendary reputation for toughness, and there's tons of videos online on boiling or freezing it in water or something like that, like a Casio G-Shock. But that takes away a little bit of its class, to be worn as a semi-formal dress piece, like the Rolex Sub or the 50 Fathoms. And that's okay. It stays true to its roots all these years later, a symbol of a time before what will be turned into what could have been. Like how in the 60s, the journey to space and the moon felt like the first step in the much larger adventure than the furthest place a person would travel for the next 50 years. And oh yeah, that's another thing. The watch was worn in space too, by a cosmonaut retro on the Soyuz 17 spacecraft, Salyut 4 space station. So this watch is the answer when you ask your mom for a plastic moon swatch Speedmaster, and she tells you we already have one at home. In general, the 1960s was a time when anything was possible, because anything was. This was before the quartz crisis, when big Swiss manufacturers were still trying to innovate on new technologies in their watches, rather than focusing on grand complications that drive up the product's market value. The watches from that era are like art from that period, representing hope and uncertainty, of progress and turmoil. I'm paraphrasing regular car reviews here, but people say that the 2020s were bad. Well, we weren't around for the 1960s. The products from that era screamed, live and dream for the now, because tomorrow may never come. And for this piece, it seems like tomorrow has never came.